the podium and talk to us regarding the study and what has been done and what is proposed to be done as we move forward.
Absolutely, thank you. So good evening, and thank you for having me tonight. My name is Megan Hilliard. I am the Director of Preservation Services at the Landmark Society of Western New York. And I'm here tonight to share with you about this exciting historic resource survey project that we have kicked off here in the village of Webster, and kind of talk to you about why we're doing this survey, what the purpose is, and what the benefits to your community can be. So I'll try to run through this pretty quickly, but I do want to give you some good information tonight. So to quickly share, if you're not familiar with our organization, the Landmark Society, we are a nonprofit preservation advocacy organization, and we were founded in 1937, which makes us one of the oldest and longest active running preservation organizations in the country. We're based in Rochester, but serve a 9-county region across the Genesee Valley and Finger Lakes regions. And so one of those is obviously Monroe County that we serve and work in. And although we have a small professional staff, our work is broad and multifaceted. We own and operate 3 historic properties. We offer a wide range of events and educational programs, including our very popular Inside Downtown and House and Garden tours that take place in the spring and summer. And at the core of our mission, or at the core of our work is our mission, which is to protect the unique architectural heritage of our region and to promote preservation and planning practices that foster healthy, livable, and sustainable communities. And we advance this through doing a lot of our programming, as I mentioned, but also through consulting services that I oversee, such as projects like the Village of Webster Historic Resource Survey that we're here to learn about tonight. I also manage our contractor referral program, so if people who own historic properties are looking for contractors that are knowledgeable with historic buildings and materials, and sometimes traditional trades, we can help connect property owners with those tradespeople, which is a great way to help protect your historic resource. Just quickly running through the historic preservation organizations and agencies that are involved in a project like we're working on right now. We work at both the local, state, and national level in preservation, and then we have our government and then our nonprofit sides. With the Village of Webster Historic Resource Survey, we're mostly working at a local level right now, with the Village of Webster being the ones who contracted the Landmark Society. We are your consultant undertaking the work. This project was partially funded by the Preservation League of New York State. You see them under the state nonprofit. They're our statewide historic preservation advocacy organization. And they administer the Preserve New York grant, which is something the village got to help with this project. Ultimately, this survey report will be submitted to both the village and also the New York State Historic Preservation Office. We call them SHPO, S-H-P-O for short, so if you hear me using that tonight, that's what I'm referring to. SHPO ultimately is the one that will review the work and the recommendations that come out of this survey and decide whether or not they agree with our recommendations as far as potential historic districts, historic properties, and so that's sort of everybody who's involved here. Later on, you'll be hearing about a next step process that could come after this survey, and that would then involve the National Park Service that you see up there on the national level. Go ahead. So just to quickly run through the project background and where we're at right now. Obviously, the first bullet that you see here is pretty obvious. The Village of Webster received the Preserve New York grant through the Preservation League of New York State to assist with the cost of the survey of this project, and then contracted with us at the Landmark Society to undertake this work. And we've begun the initial survey work, and we'll be, and you'll hear a little bit more about this later about what we've done so far, but we've begun very initial survey work, and then throughout the winter and very early spring is when I do most of the research and writing of the historic context portion of the report, which will include the historic development, and history of the village, so kind of laying out that overall where the village came from, why it's significant. In the early spring, you will start to see us out walking the streets of the village, where we will be photographing every property in our survey area that we are further documenting, so it's probably going to be a few hundred properties. We photograph each property because later on we will be creating inventory forms which become part of this survey report. So to run through quickly, what is a historic resource survey? This is essentially an inventory of a community's historic resources. And historic resources can include buildings, sites, structures, landscapes, and objects that are generally 50 years or older. Just to kind of put in a little, where does that 50 years or older come from? That is a standard by the National Park Service. So basically anything that's 50 years or older can be considered historic for purposes of listing in the National Register of Historic Places. So that's kind of a standard number that we go by. The purpose of the survey is to identify individual properties and areas that appear to meet the criteria for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, and to create a comprehensive record of the historically significant resources within the Village of Webster. The completed survey report becomes an important planning tool for the village. It can help inform decision-making related to development, land use, and long-term planning, and identifying which resources are historically significant and should be considered early in planning processes. The survey can also support heritage tourism and strengthen community pride by increasing public awareness and appreciation for the village's historic building stock. For example, understanding where historic resources are located can help the village board make more informed decisions about development proposals. And it can also increase awareness of these resources and encourage businesses and property owners to reinvest in and reuse vacant or underutilized historic buildings, and rather than pursuing new construction, which isn't necessarily a bad thing either, but that supports both preservation and sustainable growth. This slide here, you'll see on the right-hand side is the survey area. So the Village of Webster Historic Resource Survey will be conducted within the municipal boundaries of the village. And we began this project back in September with a stakeholder kickoff meeting, which included representatives from the village, as well as the Historical Society. This meeting ensured that all involved were on the same page about the project, this project's scope of work, and what we're hoping to get out of this survey process. Since then, I've begun some of the initial survey work, including a windshield survey. This includes driving all the streets in the village and marking maps, and areas that will be further surveyed as part of the project. So areas that appear to be historic and retain sufficient integrity and appear to have some level of historic significance will be further documented as part of this survey. Areas or properties that are new construction, meaning they're more recent than 1976, and yes, we're skipping to make 50 years next year since this will be an ongoing project. Those will not be documented as they wouldn't be considered historic for the purposes of this project. Throughout the winter, I'll be conducting research and writing about the history and the development of the village, along with other areas of significance that can be found throughout our research process, such as impacts of transportation, roadways, industries, or commerce. This will result in a historic context portion of the survey report as an overview of the village's history. In the spring, as I mentioned, you'll see our survey team out walking the streets to photograph all of the properties. This allows us to create individual inventory forms on each survey property, which will include its approximate construction date, whether there are any historic outbuildings, like a garage or a carriage house, whether it would be considered contributing or non-contributing to a potential proposed historic district, and we'll go over what that is a little bit more in detail. A brief physical description and a brief statement of significance, and this would include the architectural style of every building. All of the photographs will be taken from the public right away. We don't enter any private property. It's not on purpose to get photos. And then in the late spring, early summer, the draft report will be submitted to both the village and the New York SHPO for review. Should they have any edits or comments or things that need to be, or that they would like added, then we would make those edits at that time and then submit what we would call the final survey report. If there aren't any edits to be made, then that initial submission would become the final report at that time. And once that's been submitted and accepted, we'll then work with the village to schedule another final public meeting where we'll discuss the results of the survey and what that means for the village and its residents and other property owners. At that point, the village or another organization could choose to apply for funding or from on their own the National Register nomination for any eligible district. And I'll briefly touch now on the National Register of Historic Places and what the districts are. Okay, the National Register, and this would be phase 2. This would come after the survey results and the end of the survey, which is the project we're working on now. The next step after that you move into would ideally be a National Register designation. So the National Register was established by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. That's when we really realized that our built environment is important and we should try to preserve it. This is an official list of historic buildings, sites, structures, and objects that are recognized as significant in American history. It can be for American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, or culture. Any of those can be a reason to list something in the National Register. These resources can be listed either individually or as contributing to a historic district, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And one of the biggest things that I would like you to take away from what I talk about tonight and what that next process would be is that listing in the National Register, contrary to popular belief, is actually an honorary designation. It comes with no restrictions for private property owners unless there's state or federal funding involved in a project. So if you're a homeowner within a potential National Register eligible district and the village were to move forward with that as a next phase project, this would not stop you from doing whatever you want to do to your property, with the caveat that you still have to follow local building and permits and zoning regulations, obviously. But this is an honorary designation. The state and the federal government do not come in and tell you what you can and can't do with your property unless you're using funding from them, which is generally not going to happen with a homeowner. Okay, next. So what is a historic district? These are groupings of properties such as residential neighborhoods, commercial downtowns, and industrial complexes. Here you guys have a little bit of all of that in the village that we'll be taking a look at. The district boundaries are generally determined by several factors, such as the history and development of the area, as well as historic integrity of the buildings that are within a boundary of a proposed district. So it has to create a cohesive boundary and grouping of buildings. And then again, as I mentioned before, properties within a district are labeled either as contributing or non-contributing to the district. Examples of contributing resources are those that are at least 50 years old, retain exterior integrity that we're looking at when it comes to a district. We don't look at the interior. And even if some of the materials have changed, but it contributes to the overall cohesiveness of a streetscape and the setting and the development history of the surrounding properties, that could be a contributing property. Resources that would be considered non-contributing would be those that are more recently constructed, so post-1976, or that they've been significantly altered on their exterior, so much so that it really doesn't resemble its historic appearance in any way. There are currently 5 properties within the village that are listed individually in the National Register, so I think that's important to point out. They are the Jane and Mason Bank Building at 11 East Main, where I think that's where Nest Things is now. Webster Grange, number 436, which is also known as Harmony House. The William C. Jane House on East Main Street. The George Mason House at 39 Dunning Avenue, and then the Cobblestone Webster Baptist Church on South Avenue. So you do have some properties here that are already designated. In addition, the Xerox Webster complex, which falls within the village boundary, has been flagged as likely eligible prior to the survey starting. This is something in the state's cultural resource information system. It's been flagged as likely eligible with additional research and documentation necessary for SHPO to make that final determination. And while this survey does not delve deep into individual property history itself, it does help flesh out some of the uncertainties that help the state then make these determinations on districts and individual properties. We do anticipate recommending at least one historic district in the village. That was kind of the start of this project to begin with. It's pretty clear there's a historic district here in the village of Webster, particularly much of the residential streets south of Main and east of South Avenue. But this survey will help us kind of determine what are those actual boundaries and what is their historic significance, what is the history of the village that ties it all together and rises to that level of National Register designation. It'll also help us determine whether there's portions of the commercial core along Main Street and whether or not they contribute to the cohesive district per the National Park Service standards. So you may be wondering why bother with the survey or the pursuit of a National Register nomination later on. The survey does act as the first step towards designation, which comes with several benefits. Listing in the National Register offers many of those same benefits, such as promoting heritage tourism and economic development, raising awareness and community pride in the past, and offering a tool for the village to reference when making planning and development decisions. However, first and foremost, if there's anything, again, that you take away from this talk tonight, it's that the National Register listing is an honorary designation. And it doesn't come with any restrictions to private property owners. I've mentioned that a second time because it's very important for people to understand. Neither the state or federal government will step in and tell you what you can and can't do with your property just because it's listed. Listing can also open other funding opportunities through grant and loan programs. These are typically geared towards nonprofit organizations and municipalities rather than private property owners. However, sometimes, depending on that grant source, they can trickle down from a municipality getting it to individual property owners. So something like this does open up opportunities. In addition, there is, as a side note, because you already have a church that's listed and potentially could have more, there's also what's called the Sacred Sites Grant through the New York Landmarks Conservancy. That's a nonprofit out of New York City. But they run a grant program specifically for historic houses of worship to get money for repairing and preserving their buildings. The most enticing benefit to listing the National Register is the opportunity to utilize the state and federal historic tax credit programs, which offer tax credits for repair, maintenance, rehabilitation, and upgrades to your property. So there are financial opportunities for most property owners who have properties designated in the National Register. Okay. There are 3 historic tax credit programs I'll go over quickly because this is truly the biggest carrot to why have a survey done. It's because we're trying to find a National Register nomination, which I'm very confident you have here. So there are 3 historic tax credit programs to be aware of that property owners would become eligible for should this move past the survey into the National Register. The first is the New York State Historic Homeownership Tax Credit, which would probably benefit the majority of property owners in the district that we're likely going to be proposing from this project. This is administered by the State Historic Preservation Office. It has to be an owner-occupied residence, so it can be either your main residence or a secondary residence, but you have to live there at least a portion of the year. It does have to be in a qualifying census tract. I check this almost daily because census isn't up to me or the State Historic Preservation Office. Right now, the village of Webster is in a qualifying census tract, so that means you're eligible for the tax credit once listed. And you have to spend at least $5,000 in total qualified rehabilitation expenses, which most people who own a home probably know that $5,000 is pretty easy to spend doing maintenance and upgrades and repairs. This is a state income tax credit, so not a grant program, but a tax credit on your state income taxes that's equal to 20% of your qualified rehabilitation expenses. So 20% of what you spend to repair, upgrade your home is you get a 20% tax credit back on that from the state. So a really great program, a great incentive for people to maintain their homes and be able to do repair work that maybe they couldn't have before.
And that can be interior things as well, right?
Yes, so it can be exterior or interior work, although that's a great point because there does have to be, of that $5,000 or any total that you spend, 5% of your total spent does have to be for exterior work. So, sometimes we help homeowners who are coming in and they're repairing their wood floors and maybe doing some plaster work, but they really didn't have anything on the exterior of their home. So we'll say, does your porch need a new coat of paint? You'd be surprised how quickly a small area of painting outside can get you to that 5%. So yes, thank you for that. The other program that would probably be of interest to some other property owners here is the Commercial Historic Tax Credit Program. This is administered by the National Park Service, but it runs through the New York State SHPO office. It is a state income tax credit that's equal to 30% of your QREs, and that is for projects that are $2.5 million or less. So most of those are going to be your Main Street type buildings. And it's a 20% tax credit if your project is more than 2.5 million. Then there's a federal income tax credit that's equal to 20%. So if you have a commercial building that is listed in the National Register, you could potentially get up to a 50% tax credit between the state and the federal credit. And this is available to properties that will be used for businesses or income-producing purposes. And it must also meet a substantial rehabilitation test. This, in a very brief nutshell, means that you take the overall value of the property and the land it's on, what you purchased it for, minus depreciation, minus the value of the land, and you have to spend more than that number to be able to use this program. So it depends building by building and project by project whether you meet that, but still a great program. And the way that this commercial program works is that the state program piggybacks off the federal program. So if you are approved for the federal tax credit, you are automatically approved for the state tax credit in whichever one of those two tax credit brackets that you fall under depending on the cost of your project.
And it can be used more than once too, right?
Yes, so particularly with the homeowner tax credit, you can use that over and over again. So once you close out a project and claim the tax credit, you can open up a new one. There's no limit to how many times you can apply to use that program. Commercial technically works the same way, but having to meet that substantial rehabilitation requirement could preclude a property owner from going back to it again if they do enough work the first time around.
Thank you.
All right, and the final one, and also our final thing I'm talking about, is the New York State Historic Barn Tax Credit. Now, I don't know if there's a whole lot of property owners in the village that this might apply to, but there could be a few, so I wanted to mention it. This is administered by the New York SHPO again. This program is different from the other two that we just talked about in that the barn does not have to be listed in the National Register to be eligible. It doesn't have to have any historic designation. All that it has to do is that you have to be a New York State taxpayer. The barn has to have been built prior to 1946 and originally used for an agricultural related purpose. Now I know the village, you're probably thinking we don't have agricultural land here in barn complexes, but what you may have are homeowners who have what we would call a carriage house instead of a garage. And those are considered barns or agriculturally related because once upon a time a horse pulled the carriage into it. So you may have property owners here in the village who have a carriage house rather than a garage, and they would be able to use this program, which is great because the one thing I didn't mention of the homeowner program is that tax credit is only available for your main house. If you have a detached garage, unfortunately, and I don't love this, you can't use the tax credit for work to do to that garage. If your garage is attached to your house, physically attached to your house, you can use the tax credit. But if it's detached and it's technically a carriage house, then you're in luck. You could use this New York State Historic Barn tax credit for work on that. And that is a 25% tax credit for qualified expenses. The only thing that it can't do is the barn or carriage house can't have been used for a residence 1 year prior to applying for this tax credit, and it can't be, the project that you are doing with the tax credit can't be to turn it into a residence. So it just can't have a residential purpose. Other than that, people have used it to create event venues and all sorts of things, or just to repair their carriage house or their barns. It's a great program. So there are multiple financial incentives for being listed in the National Register, and then also this barn tax credit, whether you are or not listed. So last one. I know this is a lot of information, but I hope that this leaves you all with a better understanding of the project we're currently working on, what we're doing, kind of the timeline of when this should be completed. At this point, the survey, the draft survey should be submitted to both the village and the state in kind of late spring, early summer next year, with the final survey report being submitted by mid-end of summer, should there be any edits requested. So that's kind of the timeline we're on, the project we're working on, and a little information about why we're doing the survey to eventually lead potentially to a National Register district. Any questions?
Is it tax credit retroactive?
So the homeowner tax credit is not, unfortunately. The way that one works, I know, and people always get listed right after they've done a big project too. The homeowner credit, you do have to apply and have your work approved by the State Preservation Office first. Generally, the only time that they would give you approval to start before you have a full application is if you have, like, your boiler goes in the middle of winter. As long as you call them and they know it's happening and you get your application in that week, they usually will. It's not really retroactive approving, but in a way, I guess that is. But you still have to be listed in the National Register to submit that application. The barn tax credit, however, I do believe that they can look back to work that was done, I believe it was up to 5 years prior to your application, but you have to be able to submit before and after photographs with that so they can see the work that was done.
You mentioned church. Does it have to be currently used as a church or do past uses of it as a church?
So, yes, so for the Sacred Sites Grant through the New York Landmarks Conservancy, it does have to be actively used for a congregation.
Okay.
And specifically, it has to be used for like services, for religious services.
All right, thanks.
Questions? If not, you're welcome to reach out to me anytime. Oh, yes.
I have a couple. You said you're constantly checking to see what is a qualified census tract. What determines that qualification, and is that something that can change? If it is the qualified census tract, can that be removed for any reason?
So the qualifying census tract is done when they do the census surveys. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure off the top of my head what agency does that with the state. And basically what it has to do with is what the median income is. And I am not sure off the top of my head how that's determined for tax credits, what that cutoff is. But that it can change every time the census is done.
Sure.
But basically what happens is if that changes, so let's say we get this survey done and the village decides to move forward with a National Register nomination, which is about another year-long process. During that year, all of a sudden the census is redone and for some reason the village is no longer in an eligible census tract. You're given a grace period, so it's generally, like right now I know there's some areas of downtown Rochester that are in a grace period that would take them until April of 2027 to be eligible for the program. So that's kind of how that would work. So it's not like you would just all of a sudden, oh, we're in the middle of this project and all of a sudden, oh, you're not eligible anymore. So there's generally a grace period, as well as the fact that a lot of times when the census is redone, it brings you back into qualification anyways.
And I have a couple more questions. How long has the barn program been in existence?
So that's a good question. The current program was brought back, I think, about 5 years ago. The state had one previously and got rid of it, and then were convinced to bring it back. So I think the current program has been running for about 5 years.
Okay.
But it's not well known, so we're trying to spread the word.
And there are a lot of properties in the village with carriage houses like that.
Yeah, so this would be great for them to know about.
It would be, and those are often very expensive and sometimes cost prohibitive to actually restore and
Right.
keep up.
And that information will also be included in the survey report. There will be information on all of these tax credit programs. So I can't say that every resident in the village will read the whole survey report,
Sure.
but that'll be there too. So hopefully, as more people hear about this, spread the word to your neighbors, and get more people to start using it.
Okay, and just one more question.
Sure.
This was actually done in 1992. I suspect that you perhaps were just a twinkle in your parents' eye, or maybe in preschool at that time. But, and obviously there are buildings that have become 50 years old since then. But will the initial data from that survey in 92 be used to perhaps lessen the work? Or will it be taken into consideration as you move this new project forward?
So yeah, I do have a copy of that 1992 survey. I think what happened with that survey is that was never submitted to the state. I think it was just used for kind of local knowledge purposes. So that never became a survey that went to the state to determine National Register eligibility.
Interesting.
So this survey here is pretty much updating, a complete update and overhaul of that 1992 survey, which we are using to kind of see if there's some differences to pull in the historic context. But overall, this will be a completely updated survey that will then get submitted to the state. And the nice thing about that is then it's a record that they hold. So if something is determined eligible, it goes into their database system so everyone's aware of that. So yes, to answer your question, we are using that survey, but doing a major update to it.
So who's responsible for submitting that to the state? Is that something that you will report to the village board and then they have to take a resolution to approve that being submitted? Or how did it get dropped in 92?
So I'm not sure about 1992. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think the 1992 survey was more potentially led with the Historical Society, I think, and volunteers who did that. So I don't know that it was ever intended to be submitted to the state necessarily. At the end of this survey project, part of our contract is to submit it. So when I send it to the village, I will also be submitting it to the state through their database system for review.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So since the 92 survey, there have been a ton of homes in the village that are eligible for historic.
Yes, I have a feeling that from the properties documented in the 1992 survey, we're probably going to have a lot more now.
Chance track,
So, yeah.
and Meter Village, I don't know.
Yeah, so it'll be really interesting to see the full results of this survey compared to what it was in 1992.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Carol, did you have any other questions for Megan?
I know that you already heard about this in our stakeholder meeting too, so.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me. Please feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.